the year comes to a close, let's look back to see how far the space has gone during this entire 2020. It has not been exactly the best year that we hoped for, but there are a lot of benefits that came out of the year 2020. The first thing that came out was bonding curves. Bonding curves are not anything new in the space, but suddenly everyone started to understand what bonding curves are and to look at the different applications and way to use bonding curves in these different DeFi mechanisms and DeFi protocols. So we have a few use cases, and we talked about them as well. So the first one is obviously AMMs, autonomous market makers. We have a lot of different use cases in AMMs. So we have two assets like Uniswap. We have the derivatives kind of black hole swap. We have this PMM that's created by Doodle Exchange. And then we have multiple assets. So we have Balancer, we have Curve, all these different kind of protocols that combine different assets together in their liquidity pool. We have single-sided AMMs. So you have Seed Chain, Bancor, you have Stable USD that's created by Andre Cronje. We also looked at governance. So the bonding curves are also applicable in governance tokens, governance kind of mechanisms. We have valuation and curve functions. We talk about how curves are not just a square curve or a power function curve, but they can have sigmoid functions, they can have linear functions, they can have a logarithm function, and the functions are very variable, and you can just play around with the different kind of functions to give you different pricing when it comes to bonding curves. We also talked about how bonding curves can be used in fundraising. So Givers, Aragon, Molecule, and Fairmint, these are examples of how they use bonding curves in their fundraising mechanisms. And lastly, in bonding curves, we have NFTs. So social tokens, art tokens, the different kind of applications that are not the usual DeFi mechanisms, but like artists, art itself, you can put them or embed bonding curves into the models. In bonding curves itself, there isn't much drama going on, so that's very good. Everyone's very focused on the math. There are a lot of technical papers out there that's created by very, very brilliant people talking about GMMs, CMMs, CFMMs, and CLPs, all the different kind of bonding curve mechanisms. That's number one, bonding curves. Number two, it's yield farming. So if you remember the peak of summer 2020, it's really just yield farming. We talked about the good, the bad, the ugly before, and there's so many projects using yield farming. So we have yield farming started with synthetics, and then Curve was also doing yield farming, Compound, Balancer, all these different DeFi projects started to use yield farming as their mechanism, as their crowdsourcing strategy to get people onto their platform. And then the different tools available would be InstaDebt and DeFi that has brilliant tutorials talking about how yield farming can be, how to do with yield farming, how to yield farm in new different protocols. That's wonderful. Check him out. And one of the biggest shifts that we saw in yield farming was that yield farming was predominantly in stable coins because you have low volatility in price changes. And then, so that was how yield farming started. And then yield farming got to a bit more non-stable assets, so a bit more volatile assets like Red BTC, BET. There's one point BET was going crazy, and you have all these other different assets that are coming into play. And yield farming became a thing. The two dramas in the yield farming space, I know the time passed. It seems like a long time ago, but it's actually quite recent. The first one is the vampire swap with SushiSwap. So SushiSwap was doing yield farming to add liquidity into their AMM, and it's very similar to Uniswap. And what they did was they did whatever they did with the yield farming thing, and then they took out almost a huge chunk of liquidity from Uniswap to SushiSwap. So that was a vampire attack that happened with Uniswap and SushiSwap. The other thing that happened was Yem. I don't know if you remember Yem Protocol. Yem Protocol was one of the first food coins, and it was also one of the cleanest UI and UX for people to start adding the tokens into this platform and start yield farming or start mining. So that went very well. It used Ampleforce rebasing methods, and it hit a huge high, and then it went back down to what it's meant to be. But the kicker, the thing that was a big drama, was the whole governance token. Because when you get Yem, you also get governance token, and there wasn't enough governance votes, or the governance mechanism was not designed well, and there was some errors in that. So you could not, the whole thing went a bit array, and things were not what it was meant to be. So they moved on to YAM version 2, YAM version 3, and they lost a few people along the way. But there was one of the big dramas that happened in the yield farming space. The other thing that we have to talk about when we're talking about crypto and DeFi is Bitcoins. So if you remember this year, there are a few main events that happened with Bitcoin. The first thing that happened in around late Q1 was Bitcoin halving. So you know that every 4 years, the block rewards for Bitcoin halves. So it was whatever, and then it's 50, and then 25, 12.5, now it's 12.5, and 4 years later, it'll be 6.25. So that shift in block rewards changes the economics and changes the behaviors of how people view the currency. And that's an independent situation on its own. The cool thing is that there wasn't a lot of buzz and a lot of hype around it, so that's in general a very good thing. There's also a maturity in the derivatives market, the futures market of Bitcoin, so it definitely has some impact to lessening the price volatility with the halving event. The other thing that happened with Bitcoin, which is quite recent, is a new all-time high. Bitcoin hit $23,000 US, and it has the highest all-time high in terms of market cap because there's more Bitcoins out in the space as well, and that's very good. What drove this? Predominantly, it's the institutional investors. So there are more digital funds, so digital assets funds, creating digital assets, having Bitcoins in their portfolio. You have public companies, you have hedge fund managers, you have all these institutional investors coming in saying that, guys, the real world economy is messed up, and maybe it's time to look at Bitcoin as an inflation hedge. So there were a lot of theses that came out, there were a lot of announcements, a lot of PR announcements, a lot of publicly listed companies purchasing Bitcoins to be adding into their portfolio. So that definitely helped to drive the increase of trying to hold more Bitcoins. In fact, there is an increase in the number of wallets holding more than 1,000 Bitcoins. So that definitely shows that there are more institutional players holding a lot of Bitcoins in their portfolio. And we also talked about how Bitcoin has value, how Bitcoin accrues value from a metalist understanding of how money has value to a chartalist understanding of how money has value. So metalist money is that if I have a coin, the value of the coin is determined by the metal and the weight and the materials used to create the coin. A chartalist money is whatever money that is written and stamped on that coin itself. And in that kind of situation, we place the trust in the government, or we place the trust in the issuer of this currency. With Bitcoin, we did start with pricing Bitcoin in terms of the materials used to create Bitcoin. So there will be your GPU, your ASICs, your electricity used. And today, we've shifted to really putting trust in the machine, putting trust in the asset, putting trust in the technology behind this asset, which gives rise to the price. And then, of course, there's scarcity, there's humans' behavior, there's market action. So that's also something to consider. And that was the general idea. Then we also did talk about if Bitcoin will be an international currency. There were a few little chatters here and there, and we talked about how Bitcoin will never be an international currency because its main fundamental use case, right now at least if you see what the market is doing, is to use it as a store of value. So it has the same situation as gold. So that's the Bitcoin story, and a lot of institutional players are coming in, so that's going to be extremely fun for next year. We also have DeFi investments. With institutional players, you have also investors coming in. So we have a lot more VC investors coming in. People have their different investment theses, and one of the biggest shifts from summer was that during summertime, everyone was just looking at charts, refreshing CoinGecko, looking at the candle charts and trying to make your bets or trying to invest using that kind of strategies. Then there was a shift in autumn and winter time where people started to realize that, hey, tokens actually are something. Tokens are not just this random thing where I just look at the charts. There are a lot of fundamentals that go into tokens that tokens are considering. And so maybe if I'm investing in tokens, I need to start looking at these fundamentals. And there was a big shift that happened. People were talking a lot more about fundamentals. People were talking and discussing a lot more about these kind of things. And then we had a chat with Arthur from DeFi Finance Capital, talking about his investment theses, his advice to investors. And one of the biggest trends that you see is that a lot of these big VCs or digital funds and institutional players, if they even touch anything more than Bitcoin, is that they're still using the top 10 or top 20 coins that is available on Binance, on CoinGecko, on CoinMarketCap, and all these different platforms. The reality is that DeFi is a whole new space compared to just crypto, right? Because DeFi is quite different from just crypto in general. Crypto in general includes layer 1, layer 2, all the other application layers, and DeFi is quite unique on its own. So this is something that not many investors are looking at. They just think of DeFi equals crypto, and if DeFi is growing, the whole of crypto is growing. There might be a correlation to that, but there might not be a direct causation, right? So DeFi is growing. There are a lot of things that's going on in DeFi. It's super interesting, and there are a lot of mechanisms and innovations coming out. Does it always translate to the entire crypto space in general? Sometimes yes, sometimes no. So there are a lot of other opportunities worth checking out for these investors category that just popped out in DeFi. The other thing that came out, which I think is super exciting, is derivatives. I think derivatives is probably one of the biggest drivers to maturing of a space, because derivatives is a bet on the future. If there's no future to bet on, then the derivatives just wouldn't exist. So there's a huge maturity in the derivatives space. So first we have options. Options like hedging, OPYN, opium portion. Then we have leverage tokens like FTX. Binance did try it. They failed, but it's good that they tried. Really appreciate that. They needed to be a bit more transparent, and they needed to educate the people a little bit more. So leverage tokens are a thing. And yeah, FTX started it. SBF is like really good. You should follow him. Then we also talked about repo and futures. So we talked about FlexUSD, how they look at the derivatives market, how they look at the fact that they have physically delivered Bitcoins, as well as short-term lending and borrowing. How do we bring these kind of institutional lending, almost like institutional to institutional lending into the place, into the space for us to play? And how can retail users like you and me earn from that through FlexUSD? And lastly, we have bonds as well. So the mechanism that bonds use are, in general, the general idea is quite similar to a lot of these option mechanisms. For example, opium. So it's really a matching market, trying to match your counterparties to reduce the counterparty risk, and trying to use tokens to incentivize different kind of trade. The difference is that options are usually single assets, and you're trying to reduce the volatility or trying to hedge against different kind of things that you want in these options. And it creates an NFT out of your whatever trade. With bonds, you can create slightly more complicated products. You can mix a lot of stable, non-stable tokens together, and you can structure your product in a very interesting way to give you the lowest financial risk and trying to maximize whatever returns that you're looking for, and then finding counterparties to that. So we talked about bond bridge, and we talked about what kind of improvements bond bridge should look at, and what kind of governance needs to be involved in these kind of derivatives. Which brings me to the next one, which is number 6 trend, is governance. Governance. Everyone is issuing governance tokens, everyone is issuing governance coin, and you start to ask, is it really necessary? And to what extent do we need governance, and how is governance solved? The thing is, governance is a very, very difficult thing. Even the real world that we have today, even the big countries like the US, like the UK, they're not exactly governing the country very well. So how can we can't just slap the word governance on top of something and say that the problem is solved. It really is just the tip of the iceberg. So governance is something that a lot of people are exploring. There are a lot of governance tokens being given away. So how do you manage governance? How do you manage a decentralized participation? So one thing that is done is DAOs, and DAOs are decentralized autonomous organization. We talked about that. That's probably going to be the future of governance when we talk about a decentralized group of people. So we have governance token, we have the mechanism, which is a DAO, and then we have you can definitely add bonding curves into that. One example of that would be Aragon. So they have bonding curves and DAOs in their mechanism of governance. So Aragon focuses on governance tokens and governance mechanisms. Number 7 is Libra. I don't know if you still remember Libra. It was talked about a lot in the beginning of the year. Libra is going to change the world. Libra is going to make a huge impact on the world. Libra is going to bring Facebook to the financial space, and Libra is going to make the world a better place. Libra has a lot of press and a lot of people joining their consortium, but there were also a lot of people leaving the consortium. So they changed their wallet to Calibra, they changed their name Libra to Diem, and they are in the midst of doing a lot of regulatory stuff. The other thing to Libra, which is on that kind of global level, is China's DCEP. So China's DCEP is China's DCEP, so it's the digital currency, and DCEP is the digital currency that's used in China, so it's CBDC, Central Bank Digital Currency, CBDC. And DCEP is the digital currency, the digital yuan that's created by the Central Bank of China. And they launched the first few attempts. They gave out tokens, or they gave out these digital yuan to citizens for them to try to use. And then they have a huge network of people that is in a consortium called BSN. So just really turning this CBDC into reality, and not just something that is an idea. This has inspired a lot of other central banks around the world. So China's CBDC is the central bank digital currency. And in the central bank digital currency, what we are looking at is using the digital yuan to make payments, to make cross-country payments, to make different kind of transactions, institutional transactions, and retail transactions within the ecosystem. So that is what China is doing. And this has inspired a lot of other countries, because we can see that there is a huge trend of central banks signing up agreements with a lot of companies like Consensus, like the different kind of enterprise solution blockchains, so that they can start rolling out their projects with CBDC. So you have retail CBDC, you have institutional CBDC, you have different types of CBDCs going on, and that's really exciting because they're taking this a lot more seriously. Central banks are looking at this in a more serious tone, and not just something like Libra is going to make something, we just have to have regulations to stop them from doing it. It's more like China is doing something about it, we need to step up. So I think that's good in terms of innovation, in terms of making the space a little bit more tech-friendly, because that's going to be the future that we're looking at anyway. The eighth thing that we're looking at is insurance. So we talked about the economics of insurance, which is a very interesting topic on its own anyway, because insurance is a very inefficient system. There are a lot of opacity to that, and there are a lot of different kind of moral hazards and adverse selection in insurance. So how can we resolve insurance on its own? That is a huge field in economics. What we're trying to do is to bring that into the crypto space and to use tokens as a way to align incentives between these different participants. So we talked about two types of insurance. The first type of insurance is the insurance against the internal risk, which is the internal technical risk. When we talk about smart contract, when we talk about bugs in the system, how do we solve that? How do we reduce that kind of risk and impact? So we have Nexus Mutual in that category. The other one is impermanent loss. So we talked about bonding curves, we talked about decentralized exchanges, decentralized liquidity pools, and one of the risks in participating in that is that you have this thing called impermanent loss. So impermanent loss is something that you can't control, it just exists, and it's just unrealized loss. And so when we talk about unrealized loss, what can the protocol do to insure against your loss? So Bancor version 2.1 talks about that, and we also talked about it. And if you want to talk about how to insure against price volatility, that's where we go back to derivatives again. We talk about options, we talk about bonds, and you can structure them in a way to hedge against your financial risk. So that's a little bit more complicated, but in general, it's a very straightforward idea. The mechanism is complicated, the outcome is very straightforward. So the ninth thing that I want to talk about is features. So we talked about Ponzinomics because the height of summer 2020 is really about Ponzinomics. There are a lot of Ponzi scams going on. There were a lot of people trying to use economics to run Ponzi scams, which is not right, and some people fall for it. So how do you fight against that? And there are a lot of examples of that, like rug pull is one of the examples of Ponzi scams. The other feature of DeFi is flash loans. And there were so many hacks this year when it when that involves flash loans. And the thing is, I don't know if you can call it a hack, because if it's an exploit in the contract, it's a bug in the contract, that's a hack. But if you're using the smart contract, if you're using flash loans to do very complicated, very difficult trades to mitigate your loss and to mitigate your risk and to increase your exposure to your upside, maybe you're just a really good trader. That being said, a lot of people lost money in flash loans. A lot of people suffer a lot of risk and losses in flash loans. So that's still a very complicated product. And if you're not comfortable with very complicated products, then don't use it first. The other thing in the feature is credit delegation. So flash loan and credit delegation are created by Aave. Credit delegation is where you have credit score and you delegate it to someone. They can borrow against your credit. So that's the general idea. And these are the general features. There are a lot more other stuff that goes on, but it's more of an expansion or new innovation around the basic general models that are already in place. And lastly, we talked a lot about math. I think this year is probably one of the years where people are starting to understand and to be a bit more comfortable talking about the math and the mechanisms behind all the systems. I would say previously people are more interested in smart contracts and the contract can do that and that's good enough. But now it's more of what is the smart contract talking about? What is the smart contract saying? What's the smart contract trying to tell me? And how do I look at combining the mechanisms that you want in place to turn it to math and then to put it into code. So we talked about price slippage, how to calculate price slippage, how to calculate impermanent loss, what are the different type of fees that are involved in AMMs, so your autonomous market makers. So you can have the constant market maker mechanism like Uniswap, so zero fees, and the fees are external fees, or you can have a Thor chain kind of thing where it's CLP, so you have the fees that is involved in the formula itself, and the way of doing so is that your fees increase when the size of the trade increases. So that's a little bit more fair to the liquidity provider. And lastly, one of the things that we also talked a lot about is algorithmically rebalance stablecoins. So there are three main ways to create stablecoins. You have on-chain collaterals, off-chain collaterals, which is quite straightforward, right? You have MakerDAO doing a fantastic job with the on-chain collaterals. The off-chain collaterals will be USDC, USDT, and they just do a one-to-one back. And then with algorithmically stable ones, we have things like Ampleforth or YAM that I talked about just now. So we went through the graphs, we understand the math, what is rebalancing, and during a period of time, everyone was using this method. So during a period of time, everyone was super excited about the rebalancing time, and you could see the trade volumes just before the rebalancing time, and I think that's quite interesting to look at. So that's the 10 things that happened or 10 major things that happened in 2020. I just want to add one more, which is whatever that we talked about was still very much on DeFi, and in general, DeFi kind of just built on Ethereum first. So the other thing that happened is that there's an increase, or there's a boom in layer 1 and layer 2 solutions. So layer 1 it's not just a boom in these platforms, but also more projects are being built on these platforms. So it could be like Zilliqa, Polkadot, Near, Cadena, Filecoin, Algorand. These are projects in general created by academics, by scientists, by engineers, and they are very, very technical in their field. So these projects have been done for a long time, and trying to turn that into something that is a bit more stable with reduced fees, faster transactions, higher scalability, and that helps a lot with trying to mature the space in general. And that's just layer 1. In layer 2, we have experimented with ZK rollups, optimistic rollups, sharding, a lot of other layer 2 solutions. And that's also super fun and super exciting because right now, if you think about it, layer 1 exists, and then we have depth layers there. One of the ways to bridge these two different things, because during summertime, there were so many transactions going on the depth layers, that transactions were so expensive. They're hundreds of dollars per transaction. So one way to solve that is to have a layer 2 solution to bridge between these two. And when it comes to layer 2, which helps to resolve the transaction fees, what we could also do is to start building DeFi applications on layer 2 itself. which is another whole new world. So we have things like Loopring. So Loopring using ZK rollups, and Loopring having their own wallet with a form of P2P element in there that they're developing. And then we have Ethereum finally going to version 2, so ETH 2.0. And so there's a huge innovation and a lot of things that happened this year. Is there more or less things that happened this year? I don't know, it's really hard to tell, because the two main things that happened in 2020 that helped accelerated innovation and growth is that, number one, there was this coronavirus thing. Everyone is at home, nobody gets to go to conferences, nobody gets to travel, and if you can't travel, if you can't go to conferences, if you can't be drinking and having and partying all the time, you just sit at home and do your work, because that's what you do instead. So a lot of people are, pushing out products, pushing out innovation stuff, which is fantastic. That is one of the very good things that came out of COVID, I guess. The second thing that happened is that there was a bull market. So Ethereum all-time high, the Bitcoin also all-time high. A lot of crypto is being talked about in the news again. Crypto is getting really busy when the SEC is slamming down on a lot of things that's going on. So like BitMEX, Arthur Hayes has issues with the SEC. Now there's also Ripple having issues with SEC. So when the regulations start clamping down again, you know that it's definitely a bull market. So in general, that's what is happening. That is what has happened in year 2020, which is super fun, super exciting. And let's see what 2021 has in store. Bye.